It's my pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Michael Soulé, Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Santa Cruz. There are not many professionals to whom a field of study can be attributed. In 1985, Mike Soulé and a small group of biologists from disparate disciplines, deeply concerned about species loss around the globe, started the Society for Conservation Biology. Michael became its first president. Through his books, which outlined the tenets of the discipline, and in his many articles which explored its facets from island biogeography to population genetics to refuge connectivity, Michael inspired a generation of scientists who brought the methods, the perspective, and the commitment to jobs in government, in universities, and in conservation organizations. I'm one of those scientists. Over 2 decades ago, as a postdoc in New Zealand, I was seeing the problems in conservation biology firsthand. Introduced predators devastating populations of endemic birds, a magnificent native forest turned into sheep and then deer pasture. Then I read Soule and Wilcox. And there was not only an evolutionary approach to these problems, there were potential solutions to explore. When I met Michael in Washington, D.C. a year later, he was the Regents Fellow at the Smithsonian. He gave me additional books and papers to start the first seminar in conservation biology at the University of Otago in the South Island of New Zealand. You could see the powerful effects of those ideas on those students and many more students since. So coming here today and giving this introduction and taking a day of annual leave to do it is my chance to say thank you for 25 years of inspired leadership. Michael Elman Soulé was born in the San Diego area and received his undergraduate degree there. He went on to receive his master's and his PhD at Stanford University, studying with Paul Ehrlich. I'm not going to take time now to go through his many academic accomplishments and many, many awards, especially of late. As well as founding the Society for Conservation Biology, it's worth noting that Mike is a co-founder of the Wildlands Project, now the Wildlands Network. And much closer to home, he was the Associate Director and a board member and a life member of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. And that's why he makes his home here in Colorado. In many ways, what George Melendez Wright did to change our perspectives on parks as places of inherent value, so Michael Soulé has done for the diversity of species and their habitats. While George Wright died before the national parks embraced their role as preserves for all species, Michael Soulé has seen conservation biology become a foundation of resource management. Yet, for all its success as a discipline, species extinctions continue at staggering levels. And Michael reminds us again and again that our personal and professional success doesn't amount to much if that trend cannot be reversed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to give you Michael Soulé.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that warm welcome. And thank you all for coming here, even though there were obstacles in some of your ways, financial and others, I'm sure. It's really a pleasure to be here. I feel much more at home in front of a group of people like yourselves than in front of a group of academics who may, in theory, be interested in conservation and nature, but in their real lives, they're often more concerned with their list of publications and getting tenure and so on. But you guys put your lives on the line every day, or at least your work on the line every day, in agencies and in organizations to actually do a lot of the work. And the academics that are here, I'm sure, are just as involved, just as engaged, and just as committed as the professionals in the agencies and organizations. Anyway, I feel like I'm among friends. And I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm kind of a Luddite, so there's going to be no PowerPoint. And every time I'm tempted to use it, I go to a talk, a lecture with PowerPoint, and it fails somewhere. Almost every meeting I go to, there's a problem. So that's one of the reasons I use no technology except, well, I do have a computer. Albert Schweitzer was a humanitarian, a medical missionary, a philosopher, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wrote presciently, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth." Sadly, I think there's a lot of truth in that. But let's talk about something else for a while. Life, as we know it, is a singularity. It happened once on this planet, and probably, at least on this planet, will never happen again. It follows that life, particularly because of the amazing diversity of creatures that it has spawned, millions and millions and millions of kinds of organisms have developed on this planet, 99% of which are already extinct. But life continues to be such an amazing creative force, such a fecund phenomenon. And we are the inheritors, the beneficiaries of this evolution of life that's been going on for billions and billions of years on this planet. And it is precious. What's left is precious. And it has manifold values. There's all kinds of values. The organisms on this planet provide us with a lot of material resources. And resources is a loaded word. I'll come back to that maybe. But besides the material resources, there are spiritual values and aesthetic values that are brought to us by life, including oxygen, food, entertainment, beauty, and joy. Most importantly, life has intrinsic values. Existence value. It's valuable for itself. We need not find a use, a utilitarian property of life. It's just there and it's just valuable. And wild things, creatures, which comes from the word creation, are absolute, absolutely good, ineffable, and uncontrovertible. Life simply is. It has inherent value, intrinsic value. One of the first times I really appreciated what's been called élan vital, the life force, was when I was on sabbatical in Australia in 1973 and 74 with my family. And we went to Heron Island, and we were fortunate to be there at a time when some green turtles were emerging, were hatching and climbing up through the sand, poking their heads around, and then one by one making a beeline for the ocean through an obstacle course of gulls and other predators. No terrestrial predators there, unfortunately, except birds. And that was such an inspiring phenomenon to see, just this this force of life that creates in all creatures this will to survive and live and thrive regardless of the obstacles. And if we remember that, it helps us, I think, because in spite of the extinction rate, in spite of what's global warming and the other catastrophes, life will persist. One of the other things we saw on Heron Island were the mutton birds. That's what the sailors called them because you could eat them. I think they're shearwaters. I'm not sure. Sooty shearwaters. And they would come in at night. They couldn't see very well at night to breed on Heron Island. And they would hit the huts, and they would hit the coconut palm trees and the other trees. Bang, bang, bang. And then when they were walking around on the sand, on the ground, trying to find their mate and their nesting hole, they would mew like, it sounded awful, like ghosts. We didn't know what it was the first night we were there, and we were afraid to go outside. It sounded like zombies walking around. Anyway, that was a glorious experience. I have to admit, though, I have eaten green turtle. When I was a student and a graduate student, I was working on islands in the Gulf of California, and there were green turtles everywhere, and the boat people caught them, and they were good. I have to admit. I wouldn't do it now, but turtle meat really is good. I suppose our meat might taste good, too. So life has more than intrinsic value. It also has utilitarian value, and we eat it. We need it for our sustenance. But each extinction that occurs now diminishes life. And unless the rate of extinction is greater than the rate at which species are created by speciation, the diversity of life will decrease. And right now, that is the case. Speciation is essentially over for mammals and birds and most reptiles and amphibians. It stopped about 100 years ago for larger animals because of the disturbance and changes in ecosystems caused by human beings. Speciation requires a long period of time in total isolation in separate places before one population diverges from another. If there's gene flow, it stops speciation, gene flow between the isolated populations. And if populations are forced to move in space over a relatively short period of time, it stops the process. So basically, for mammal species larger than rats, speciation stopped about a century or more ago, meaning that for larger animals, there's no replacement going on. Things are going extinct very rapidly. The extinction rates are 1,000, 10,000 times the background rate that was normal 5,000 years ago. But there's nothing to replace the species that are going. So I wrote one time, death is one thing, the end of birth is something else, is another. According to Anthony Barnofsky and Ed Wilson and other savvy ecologists, half of birds and mammals will be among the disappeared species by the middle of this century. It's ironic, therefore, that the sixth great extinction of life on Earth has become, in the minds of some so-called conservationists, a reason to celebrate. They call themselves the new conservationists. And their leader is Peter Kariva, the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. And what they're celebrating is this new epoch, new geologic epoch. It's theoretically a new epoch, because the geologists don't necessarily agree yet. but they call it the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene. The epic of man. And what it represents is the final conquest in our manifest destiny to conquer the earth, to achieve complete dominion over the earth. And it's true that human beings and their livestock, and livestock are more numerous than human beings, have occupied and controlled virtually the entire biosphere, except for some of the higher and colder places. Among the goals of some of these Anthropocene scientists, calling themselves the new conservationists, is to de-wild the world, de-wild what remains of wildlands, and convert them to gardens. You'll be hearing about gardens tomorrow. Who are the architects of this new conservation? Well, topping the list, shockingly, is the leadership of the Nature Conservancy, including Peter Kariba, its chief scientist. And TNC's board, you should Google TNC's board of directors if you want to be shocked. And also other organizations that are affiliated with the Nature Conservancy and with certain academic institutions in California, like the Long Now Foundation, which is headed by Stuart Brand, a technophile, and Richard Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger. Probably very few of the staff of the Nature Conservancy is now promoting this new conservation idea. I'm sure most of the rank and file of the Nature Conservancy are doing good work and are in their hearts true conservationists, but that's not true of the leadership. It's not true of the board of the Nature Conservancy. Well, what is the new conservation? Dr. Kariba writes that we should stop talking about biodiversity. Biodiversity, he says, is an anachronism. It's a distraction. Instead, he says, the Nature Conservancy and other rich NGOs should invest their conservation dollars in projects that increase the standard of living in human communities, not in Aldo Leopold's land community, in human communities. By the way, the annual budget of the Nature Conservancy is about $1 billion a year. It's by far the richest NGO. It's even richer, I believe, than the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society. And Nature Conservancy's board is made up of corporate leaders, financiers, Wall Street folks that are very interested in the interface between corporate activities and conservation activities, which is what Peter Kariba is always pushing. A defining trait of the new conservationists is that they embrace the Anthropocene, the epic of complete human domination over the world. What is the sort of mythological significance of the Anthropocene? I suggest that it really defines the end times. Not exactly the same as the end times in the New Testament, but the end times for life, for biological diversity, for most of the 10 million species that occur on this planet. Another term for the new conservationists is gardeners. For the new conservationists, gardeners, that is, the Anthropocene, or the end times for life, represents a cleansing of the earth, of life forms that serve no purpose. And by no purpose, I mean no human purpose. It's kind of a purification event. And it amounts to the annihilation of most wildness, including most wilderness, most national parks, eventually, probably, most animals, and including those that ecologists refer to as keystone species. Keystone species, which include some smaller animals, like prairie dogs, for example, and some spiders, too. But we usually think of large carnivores, which are the top of the trophic cascades, the species that maintain the diversity of whole ecosystems. If the keystone species are removed from ecosystems, as you know, the ecosystems tend to collapse in diversity, as we saw in Yellowstone before the wolves were reintroduced. A good example of one of these trophic cascades, this collapse that occurs when the top keystone species are removed, is that involving the cow-nose ray in the estuaries of the East Coast. It's an interesting story about the cow-nose rays. In Chesapeake Bay, there used to be a large scallop industry. Hundreds of people made their living off of harvesting scallops in Chesapeake Bay and in other bays along the East Coast. But the scallops were disappearing very rapidly. And it turned out the marine biologists examined the reasons, and they discovered that the cow-nose ray population had greatly increased. And they were decimating all of the bivalves, the oysters and mussels and the pectins and the scallops, of course. It was similar to the story that happened in Yellowstone with the wolves. In this case, though, the top predator that was missing was not the wolf, it was sharks. And the sharks had disappeared from the coastal waters around Chesapeake Bay because of shark fin soup. And the demand in Asia, particularly China, for shark fins. And fishermen from all over Asia were coming to the East Coast of the United States and catching sharks, cutting off their fins, throwing them back in the water. Of course, they would drown without their fins. And as a result, the main predators for cow-nose rays was gone. And they said, oh boy, we can eat all the bivalves we want now. And they did. And that meant the demise of the scallop fishery. That's a trophic, so that trophic cascade, beginning with sharks, which were the police, the authorities, the policemen in the system that maintain control over the population of the rays. When you remove the police from a neighborhood, shit hits the fan, and that's what happens in the ocean. I don't have to tell you the Yellowstone story about wolves and how they maintain the diversity of species. One of the recent examples of that I heard was that pronghorn antelope are now more abundant because of the wolves in Yellowstone. The pronghorn antelope population in Yellowstone has increased because the wolves increase. What do the wolves do? They really harass coyotes. In fact, one of their treatments for coyotes is the stretch. A wolf will grab each paw on a coyote and pull it apart. That's a favorite pastime of wolves in Yellowstone. But as a result, there were fewer coyotes, there's much less predation on pronghorn antelope. So one of the benefits of wolves in Yellowstone has been a recovery of the population of the pronghorn antelope, another trophic cascade. So nature needs its large predators in order to maintain its diversity. And the people I'm calling the gardeners, they wouldn't have any large predators. There's no predators in gardens except maybe spiders. So the key to understanding this idea of the new conservation being proposed by Peter Kariva and which focuses on gardens is simple. Its objective is to advance not conservation, but the human project, to ramp up human welfare by increasing human consumption. Clearly, the goals are not conservation goals, though it's called the new conservation. They're humanitarian goals. Now, I'm not opposed to humanitarianism. I'm a human, and I think people are okay sometimes in some places and at certain levels. But humanitarian goals are not the same as conservation goals. Sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But the trouble with the new conservation is it doesn't focus on traditional conservation goals. It doesn't focus on biodiversity. The emphasis is on human happiness and well-being. It's not conservation. It's humanitarianism. And that's what we need to understand about the new conservation. Now, you may think that humans need more help. And, of course, individual humans and certain groups of humans always will need help and assistance and our compassion. But 98% of all the charitable donations from individuals and foundations in the United States go to humanitarian causes. Only 2% go to the other beings, that is to domesticated animals, animal welfare, and nature. Probably less than 1% goes to nature. So humans already get virtually all of the charity. Another thing that the new conservationists are saying, the gardeners are saying, is that when the standard of living of human communities is increased, when people have more wealth, that suddenly in them will well up this love of nature, this compassion for nature. That's what I call the trickle-down effect. If people are richer, then their concern for nature will percolate down to protect the other beings on the planet. But Peter Kariva and others who repeat this over and over and over again never give any evidence for that theory. So that's why I call it the faith-based trickle-down theory of conservation. Kariva et al. Wrote, quote, "Instead of pursuing the protection of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, a new conservation should seek to enhance those natural systems that benefit the widest number of people, especially the poor." In a way, this justifies the final solution for the biodiversity problem, if you remember the Nazis. Kariva and his colleagues also declare that nature could be a garden, and that his new conservation will measure its achievement in large part by its relevance to people, including city dwellers. So the new conservation is about productivity of materials, of food, and enjoyment for people. It's about consumption, increasing consumption, which they say, I don't think they believe, will, again, trickle down. So once people are happier and healthier and have a higher standard of living, their affection for nature will increase. In fact, quite the opposite usually happens, because the ecological footprint of people who are living at a higher standard of living is bigger, and it does more harm to nature than good. Some of us get out with our binoculars and go looking for birds or for turtles, but it's questionable whether that really does any good for nature when you consider the carbon dioxide produced by the planes we fly into these places where we can still see birds and turtles. So the ideology of the new conservation is revolutionary, but it's also reactionary, because its God is the garden. Emma Maris's message is basically the same, and you'll be hearing that tomorrow. I hope she doesn't hate me too much. Actually, we're having a drink tomorrow night. And she's a lovely person, and she's a brilliant person and a great science journalist. But I think she's wrong about what we call the gardenification of the world. So the mission of the new conservation is gardens. In vacant lots, in abandoned rail right-of-ways, in derelict farmlands, in parking lots, maybe rooftops, I don't know. They never tell you where all these gardens are going to go and how big they're going to be. But they imply that the purpose of these gardens is to provide food and enjoyment for people, to be safe harbors for exotic species. We welcome all species into our gardens, they say. Species from faraway places, like the anacondas coming from South America to the Everglades and are now eating most of the wildlife in the Everglades, which are welcomed by the gardeners. They welcome exotic species. They're Democrats. They're open-hearted, and their arms are outstretched to welcome all of the creatures from around the world, like the mongooses on the Hawaiian Islands, which are eating all the native bird species. It's a different philosophy. It's not an evil philosophy. It's a compassionate philosophy, but I think it's wrong-headed, because ultimately it's making the world into the homogenization. That is, everything will be the same. Everywhere will be the same. It'll have the same weeds, the same exotic species, and we can go from, let's say we're only concerned with Mediterranean climates. We can go from Chile to the Mediterranean to Southern California, and we'll see the same species everywhere. The same species. You won't know where you are in the world if you're in a Mediterranean climate in a few years, because all of the species will be the same. And the local endemic native species will mostly be gone. That's what we're creating. That's what gardening will create. Also, according to Emma Maris and Peter Kariva, gardens are engineered places. They are safe, comfortable, convenient, Disneyland-like, they don't say Disneyland-like, where presumably even newly hatched chicks and newborn infants will be safe. It's worrisome that the gardeners, though, never define or describe these gardens, the size and scale of the gardens, their locations, and what that does is render the concept of the garden to be very squishy. They need to define it carefully. Another problem with gardens, if you've ever had a garden, you know how much work it takes to maintain it? You know, we spend all winter and spring waiting to plant our garden. And then we spend all summer wondering why we planted so many things. Because it just occupies all of our time. We're always out there watering and weeding and finding the right things to kill the pests. So gardens require constant vigilance, assiduous, slavish care. And many of them are machine dependent. We have rototillers that till the soil, and we have leaf blowers and other machines to spray with. Gardens are weed and pest infested places, and they're expensive. So I'm not sure we want so many gardens. Another huge problem with substituting gardens for wilderness and wildlands is that they're inherently unstable. We know for sure that ecosystems collapse when the large predators are absent. There's a whole book that was recently published on this, edited by Terborg and Jim Estes, John Terborg and Jim Estes, on trophic cascades, which summarizes hundreds of cases from all over the world about what happens to systems, ecosystems, when you remove the large predators. Gardens won't have large predators. So it will require immense amount of work to maintain their stability and their diversity. And they won't have inconvenient species. like bobcats and coyotes and lynxes and cougars and wolves, not to mention elephants and rhinoceroses. This means they will lack resilience and will require a high level of maintenance. So if gardens are the final solution to the biodiversity question, I don't like it. I don't like what it looks like. I mentioned one turtle story, and the reason I'm telling turtle stories today is because, to me, turtles epitomize intrinsic value, the value of creatures for themselves. And that's something that the gardeners never talk about, is the intrinsic value of things. Their concern is the utilitarian value of things. The life force is strong in turtles. As I mentioned, the turtles coming up out of the sand on I think it was Heron Island that we saw in the 70s. The life force is strong in them because they're self-willed creatures with a powerful will to live, with élan vital, and an instinct to venture on heroic journeys, crossing oceans to reproduce themselves. My wife and I were in Trinidad last year for a few days and watched the leatherback turtles, these giant turtles that swim, the females swim, the males do too, all the way across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean to nest on beaches, tropical beaches, in out-of-the-way places where they exert. It's painful to watch them crawling up on these steep beaches to lay their eggs. It takes hours because they're not land animals, but they never give up. Turtles are mentioned in the Bible. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is gone, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, and the time of the singing of birds has come, and the voice of the turtle is heard on the land. Well, turtles don't have a voice. And that was a misquote. It was a mistranslation. They meant in that quote, the only reference to turtles, I think, in the Bible is about turtle doves, it turns out. So the new version, the new King James Version adds the word doves back in. So that error has been corrected. Turtles don't sing. I have another turtle story. It's hard for me to tell it. So I'll go back to Trinidad. That's easier. When we were in Trinidad, on the beach at Grand Riviere, waiting to watch the leatherback turtles nest, there was a rainstorm the first night we got there. And as a result of this rainstorm, the river changed its course as it came out through the beach. And when I woke up, I looked out the window, and there was a guy on the beach picking up dozens of turtle eggs and taking them over to another part of the beach and putting them down, digging another hole in the sand and burying them, and going back and getting more turtle eggs from where they were being exposed by the rampaging river. So at first I thought he was going to eat the turtle eggs, but no, he was collecting them to protect them. So we went out and we spent 2 or 3 hours with him saving turtle eggs that were being exposed by the erosion of the beach from the river, from the rainstorm the night before, and reburying them. And one of my, excuse the detour, but one of my mentors, my main mentor as an adult, was Arne Næss. Arne Næss was a brilliant philosopher and scientist who was the youngest professor ever at the University of Oslo, which was quite an honor. And he was also the founder of the deep ecology movement. And I got to know him pretty well, and I spent quite a bit of time with him in Norway and in California. And in fact, every morning when he was visiting me in California, we would study or write or whatever we did until 10 o'clock, and then we'd have a two-person seminar, and we'd discuss some topic. And one morning, the topic of our seminar was, okay, what do we do about protecting nature in the United States? Not a small question. And the answer we came up with was connectivity. We need to connect up all the wild places. So that's a good idea. So I wrote Dave Foreman a letter, who I met once, who's to me the leading conservationist in the United States now. There were others in the past, like Aldo Leopold. But Dave Foreman has a new book, Take Back Conservation, which I highly recommend, where he comes up with his analysis of how we succeed in the conservation mission. I meant to bring a box of his books to sell, but if you want one of these books, which I highly recommend, it's a no-holds-barred, interesting book about what we really need to do to save biodiversity in North America. And if you give me your name and address on a piece of paper, I'll send you a copy for $25 is what it costs. Anyway, Arne Ness and I would have these seminars, and then we'd go on a field trip to the Grand Canyon or to Baja California somewhere and spend some time in the wild. But I remembered him in this context of turtle eggs, because people would say, well, why are you doing all this work to save some turtle eggs? It's not going to make any difference. It's not going to affect the evolutionary trajectory of these leatherback turtles. Thousands of disasters much worse than that river have happened to leatherback turtles over millions of years, so why are you bothering? And Arne Ness would have said, I get very emotional when I think about Arne Ness. He would have said, because I must do it. I must save these turtles. So he understood the intrinsic value of turtles and of everything else, of all other life forms. So that's the emotional commonality to what you all are doing. You're doing it because you must. Okay, the other story, another turtle story, is about sometime last July, I think, in town, in Paonia, where I live in western Colorado, that's west. I was riding my bike into town, and I saw a turtle on the road, a slider, a local species, and it was somebody obviously run over it. And so I stopped and I picked it up and took it to the curb. Its guts were hanging out, so it didn't have any hope of surviving. And I turned around and I looked, and there were some people in a parked car half a block away, and they were laughing at me. That's the end of that story. I'm almost done. Dave Foreman asks in this book, Take Back Conservation, or he describes in this book the difference between a resourcist and a cannot. A resourcist is a person who looks at nature as a resource, who thinks that everything out there alive is a resource. If it's not a resource, what is it doing? What is its purpose? You've heard people ask, well, why are there mosquitoes? Why are there cockroaches? Why are there rats? And they don't get it. They're not evolutionary biologists. They're not Darwinists. But those are resources people. They think everything has to be a resource. In fact, most of our agencies are called resource agencies, a term I detest, and so does Dave. What it shows, according to Arne Ness, it shows a lack of education. That's all. They aren't bad people. They just are not educated people. Aldo Leopold wrote in the first line of the Sand County Almanac, "There are some of us who can live without wild things, and some who cannot." Dave Foreman writes in this book that the cannots should all get together and form the Cannot Club. Those who cannot live without nature. He suggests that cannots have a deep-seated connection or bond with wild things, with wild nature. So, for example, when sojourning in the big outside with Arne Ness, as we did in Baja California and in Borrego and other places, Arne would stop. He never looked. He hated the Grand Canyon, by the way. It was too big. It was too magnificent, too majestic. He liked little gray, dry desert arroyos where there were tiny flowers. And he would get down on his hands and knees and look at these tiny flowers. And to him, those were life. Those were expressing the life force. And he loved them. And he was a cannot. Dave Foreman says, we cannot have deep-seated connections or bonds with wild things that nurture our joy or our happiness. That's not something the gardeners have, I think. I don't think the gardeners understand our feelings for nature and why we love it and why we feel compelled to rescue turtles and other creatures, and particularly to save their habitat and provide what they need to thrive in the world as it is today. So I think I'll wrap this up. I've been talking long enough. One of the things I'd like to say in passing is that, again, to remind you that the gardeners say that once people have a high enough standard of living, that their love for the rest of creation will be kindled, and they will start to care for nature after their needs are met. I see no evidence of that. That's a completely faith-based theory, and I don't think it's true. You don't see, in my community, when people are better off, what do? They buy an ATV or a snowmobile or some other four-wheel vehicle. They don't go out and protect nature. So the basic premise of the new conservation is that when people's needs are met, they will become conservationists. Bullshit. So, in conclusion, lots of good things are happening. There's still a lot of conservation going on, and in agencies and NGOs and with private people. One of the things that my organization, I'm no longer on the board of Wildlands, but was doing is Trek West. John Davis, who went on a trek all the way up the East Coast, it was human-powered last year, is now doing the same thing in the Rocky Mountains, starting in Chihuahua and Sonora and coming up through the Rocky Mountains this summer, through here, and to encourage people to think about connectivity, about wildlife corridors. So one of the things we're hoping that will come out of Trek West, as he calls it, is a National Corridors campaign, a campaign to restore corridors, not just for wildlife, but corridors for people, for recreation too, and for education, outdoor education for students from schools all over the country who can come to the West and learn about nature, and learn about wildlife, learn about fun, the fun it is to be outside. So the struggle goes on. and in different ways, in different venues, with different methods. But we're all here because we love nature, and thank you for that. That's all. If you, I forgot to bring that box of books, but if you want a copy of Dave's latest book, which is a terrific book, Take Back Conservation, then sometime give me a note with your name and address on it, and I'll send you one for $25. That's what it costs.
Well, don't sit down, because you'll be right back up here. Thank you a lot, Mike. So now we have some time for questions from the audience. So if you would have one, please approach one of the two floor microphones to ask your question. And for those of you attending via the webcast, you can submit questions also. And a selection of them will be relayed up to us, and we'll try to intersperse the two forms of questions. So does anybody have any questions or comments they want to make for? Okay, let's start here. And please give your name. Let us know who you are.
Sure. My name is Dylan Lewis. I'm a recent graduate from Northwestern University. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on who is best prepared to manage these new wildlife corridors. Is that the National Park Service? Is it the U.S. government, or is it NGOs or other organizations? I'm interested to hear that.
Yes, all of the above. There are many levels of concern and interest in corridors. There was, in fact, it's been some kind of congressional action took place that says now that the agencies, the resource agencies, should be concerned with connectivity. And so it's in the legislation. There's a long ways, you know, between legislation and action, but and it's going to be very difficult to create corridors for migration, for dispersal, and to adapt to climate change. But it's not going to be impossible. But somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to take the lead. And I'm hoping some of you and some of my friends in the Wildlands Network will begin a National Corridors campaign after Trek West is finished in order to bring to the attention of the public the need for continental scale corridors, not just United States, but continental scale corridors that allow for adaptation to climate change, among other things, but also for dispersal and migration.
My name is Healy Hamilton. I'm an independent biologist and a member of the National Park Services Advisory Board Science Committee. Hi, Dr. Soulé. My question has to do with the strong contrast that you've driven between that you've represented between the gardeners and I would be in the cannots, in the cannot live without wild nature category, and asking if we really, in this age, can afford such a strong contrast. We have, by some estimates, a quarter of the planet that is currently in degraded state, in a state of degradation that's been already used for some purpose and in some ways discarded after use of that purpose. That is, there's a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate the resilience of nature while providing for local communities and perhaps building corridors with lands that are already degraded, taking pressure off of the lands that still remain as wild as possible. And so I ask, isn't there a little bit more of an opportunity to marry what kind of conservation is needed in what landscape to achieve our overall objective of more diversity, more human appreciation of nature, and leaving that intact nature as wild as possible?
I too strongly believe that all dualisms are false. On the other hand, they can sometimes be pedagogical. And I think it's necessary to draw to describe what I see clearly as a threat to nature. And I think the gardening of the world is an attempt to substitute human welfare, human well-being, humanitarianism, for a concern for nature. And I don't believe that there is a trickle-down effect, and that's going to help nature. So in most situations, I would agree we must reach out to these people who we have some philosophical disagreement. But I think the distance is so great. I also suggest that if you are sympathetic with this, you should Google the board of directors of the Nature Conservancy and see who they are. And that will help you understand why I'm worried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have we had any questions come in? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a question from Tom Filippi. What do you think of Mike Rosenzweig's concept that most species will be considered in human-dominated ecosystems, conserved in human-dominated ecosystems, that semi-wild areas are crucial in addition to wild lands?
I certainly agree that we need transition zones between wild lands, which are self-willed lands, where the creatures are self-willed. They're in control of themselves and their lives, and the garden at the other extreme. But we have to be careful, because most of the land in the world is now under human control, or human surrogates, that is, cattle and sheep and goats, and in direct use by humans. So, and there isn't much wildlands left. It's mostly in the boreal now. So I think we need to staunchly defend what remains of wilderness and wildness in the world, and not compromise too soon, and not be nicey-nicey all the time.
Yeah, we have a few more. From Jerry Freilich. What is your current thinking about the intelligent tinkerer? The idea that the first imperative is to save all the parts. You didn't mention this particular argument for biodiversity in your talk. Is this still an important concept in your current thinking?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. The intelligent what?
The intelligent tinkerer.
Tinkerer. Well, that's what conservation biologists are, isn't it? Intelligent tinkerers, mostly intelligent. Anyway. I think we have to be very careful when we're tinkering. And I come back to the importance of carnivores, particularly large carnivores. Right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has killed thousands of wolves, and at the behest of ranchers, mostly in the West. And is that intelligent tinkering, or is it political tinkering? So we can't help tinkering, but as Aldo Leopold says, we have to keep all the pieces and put them back together at some point. So it's easy to justify what we want to do. We have all these impulses in us that drive us to do things that benefit me. Those are called sins, those impulses. And we have to be concerned and think about, well, am I really being compassionate enough and concerned with others? And the real others are the wildlife, not only other people.
Hi, thank you. My name's Chris Shaver. I'm a retired Park Service person, but still way too engaged in a number of nonprofits in this field. And I have a question related to a trend towards defining and valuing ecosystem services as a way of appealing to folks that we are not just here to use nature, but that we are in fact dependent on it to provide us with clean air and clean water and So it's not, to me, it's not quite as far as the new conservation you're talking about. It's certainly not totally intrinsic value. It's recognizing the connection. And do you have an opinion on whether that's a good thing to be talking about, or is it a slippery slope towards it's only here for us?
The latter.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. Okay.
I mean, it was kind of an interesting idea. Oh, we can get people to pay for the free services that come from nature. How many times do you get people, how often do people pay for things that they think should be free? Never. Although we're going to have to start paying for our fresh water because it's so rare, it's becoming such a rare commodity now that it's going to be commodified, and we're going to have to pay for it, people all over the world. And it's going to be really hard on the poor people in the world because they're the least able to afford clean, pure water. So, which is an ecosystem. It was an ecosystem service. Now it's a commodity. So the problem is the commercialization of ecosystem services. That's one aspect of this problem. And I don't think people want to pay for things that have been free. And they will have to, though, in some cases. So I think ecosystem services was a good idea to get people to think about all the values they get from the wild, from nature. But I don't think it's changed society. And like a lot of the arguments that some conservationists have come up with, I don't see examples of where it really works.
But we will have to, in fact, pay to correct the problems to those systems. So having people recognize that there is, in fact, an economic value, it seems is part of the solution to the deterioration.
It could be. It's just that it's hard to make that transition. People have a hard time making that transition from something that was always free to our parents, for example, and we start having to pay for it. They'll only do it if they have to, I think.
We have another question?
Three more.
Okay, let's take one.
Sounds good.
Take one, we'll come back.
Okay, yes, from Dave Graber. For those of us who can't bear the thought of ever-diminishing native biodiversity, in your opinion, what is the best investment of our personal time and money to preserve it?
Of our personal time and money to do what? To preserve it.
To preserve it.
The best way to invest our personal time. You know, students ask that question a lot. Though Dave Graber is not a student. Hi, Dave. You know, students sometimes would ask professors, well, what's the best way to be effective in the world? I'm a graduating senior in college, and I want to devote my life to protecting the world, protecting nature and humans. What's the best way to do it? And it always comes back to asking them, well, what do you do best? Are you an artist? Are you a writer? Are you a poet? Are you a painter? Do you have inclinations to become a scientist? And it just depends on where your passion and where your talent lies. And we all, not all of it, those people who have this compassion for nature, this impulse to be part of the solution, have to look at themselves and say, well, where can I be the most good? And a lot of them don't want to become biologists or can't stand genetics and failed statistics, but they may make great lawyers or writers, journalists. So people have to look at their talents and figure out how they can best make a contribution to these issues.
Hi, I'm Glenn Patterson. Thinking to Paul Ehrlich, whose name we heard mentioned in your introduction, and one of his messages back a while ago. I just wonder if you have any updates or suggestions for dealing with the human population situation.
The perennial question, population. This population is certainly one of the major roots of our dilemma in the world today. Another one is consumption, per capita consumption. Technology is a third. So we've known how to deal with population for 30 years or so. It's really simple. Empower women. However, and the reason is because when women are empowered, when women control their own lives and their own bodies, the birth rate plummets down to an average of less than 2 per woman, which will solve the problem. The trouble is there's lots of places in the world and lots of cultures in the world that don't want women to have that control over themselves, over their bodies. So the solution is simple: empower women, educate women, give women opportunities in the workforce, break the glass ceiling. Lots of good ideas, but politics rears its ugly head, and bias rears its ugly head. But that's the solution. And how we do that with cultures which want to repress, hold down women is a problem, because people don't like their cultures messed with, and some cultures are almost based on the suppression of women. But when women have education and can get into the job force, the birth rate comes down. So that's where we have to focus, I think, is feminism, basically, not giving up on that campaign to empower women.
Yes, we have one from Lori Harmon. I appreciate your discussion of the connectivity and importance of wildlife corridors, both for wildlife and people. As you proceed with your initiative, will you be connecting with previous initiatives to promote wildlife corridors, such as the Yellowstone to Yukon Corridor Initiative? And if so, in what ways?
Yes. Obviously, there's lots of initiatives, and it's not only, we not only need to embrace what's come before and the existing initiatives, but in order for a corridor campaign to be successful, it has to embrace people. It has to include corridors for recreation. It has to include education of school children, get them out into the wild in the summer to experience the out of doors. It has to benefit commercial interests, the outdoor gear industry, the REIs of the world, for example. Business has to benefit. Local communities have to benefit. And, of course, the existing infrastructures has to be maintained and enlarged. So when I'm talking about corridors, I'm talking about as much corridors for people as corridors for wildlife. But they can be made compatible. They can be zoned. But we need to focus on getting people outside and moving on the landscape, working off some of the excess pounds, and having a lot of fun and learning about nature at the same time. So when I think of corridors, I think of corridors for humans and think of the biodiversity benefits as kind of a side product that we don't, it's not the headline though. The headline has to be, what are the human benefits? What are the benefits for society?
Hi, I'm Andrew Warnock. I'm a science educator from Colorado State University, and I've got a neighbor who is a scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and we have constant debates about corporate funding. And at CSU, I'm seeing a rise in big corporations bringing large sums of money and dumping it into education efforts for science outreach and so on. Big oil companies wanting to donate $100,000, which dwarfs our budget, and Coca-Cola and Nestle coming in and offering millions. I was just hoping you could speak to that a little bit.
As I said, if you Google the Nature Conservancy's board, you'll see that it's all corporate, almost all. 1 or 2 people have some university affiliation. But and it is a great concern, because if the entire board of an organization are Wall Street types, that's the way they will think. And Peter Kariva always talks about how we have to work with the corporations. And that's not necessarily wrong. It's just that it takes eternal vigilance and drawing a line saying, okay, yeah, we appreciate your interest in your money, but we also want to protect what the values that we have as well as the values you have. And a little bit of greenwashing isn't going to hurt our mission, so that's not bad. But if the policies of the conservation organizations are usurped by the policies of the corporate world, it's a problem. So it's eternal vigilance.
Thanks.
Back to the web, and then
Yes, we have another question. This is from.
two more questions, and maybe one or two more back there, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. I have a question from Dick Barr. The subject is Anthropocene. As you talked about this new geologic epoch and stated that is focused on the belief that species evolution has stopped nearly 100 years ago, do you believe this is true when you look at the medical evidence of new strains of microbes that are antibiotic resistant?
There's a confusion between evolution and speciation. What stopped was the creation of new species of animals, of vertebrate animals, of larger animals. That's basically over because human activities all over the planet are preventing new species from being formed. But evolution continues within species. We're adapting to new diseases all the time. We're adapting to our new digital world where kids are not looking up anymore. They're always looking down. That's a selective force. It's going to change the architecture of our necks eventually. I'm being facetious. But new selection forces are coming, and they're here, and the new generation of children and people growing up will be exposed to very different selection regimes than my generation was. And that's a good thing, perhaps. So I'm not saying that evolution will stop. I'm saying that speciation, the creation of new species of vertebrate animals, is stopped.
Hi, my name is Corey Knewton. I'm a graduate student in history. I was interested in your perspective about some of the history of the conservation movement, particularly how it has often involved removing minority populations from their lands to create places that become perceived as wilderness, or using conservation discourses to suppress minority groups. And I'm interested in how you see that influencing the current movement, or how to avoid that sort of thing as we move forward.
It's true that in some places in the world, particularly in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, people were moved out of areas that the government considered to be would be more beneficially used for conservation or for economic growth or for mining or logging or some cattle grazing. Still happening in Brazil, for example, with people being moved off the land by wealthy landowners. So it's not only conservationists who are doing it, it's probably happening more because of capitalists doing it than because of conservationists doing it. But it did happen. We moved a lot of people. The whole conquest of the West and Manifest Destiny was all about taking the land away from wildlife and from indigenous peoples, which was a bad mistake. And we're paying the price for it now. But it hasn't been happening in the developed world for a long time, and I think efforts are being made. I know in Northern Europe with the Sami people, for example, certainly in this continent, I know in Canada particularly, to work with Native peoples, First Nations, in order to find ways of living with diversity. And that is the key. It's not only diversity of nature we need, it's diversity of human beings. I see a lot of diversity in this audience, not enough. We never have enough. But it's nice to see some.
Okay, we have one from Kat Hawkins Hoffman. The subject is how to get more specific to guide management decisions. And the question, maintaining natural conditions has long been the background, if not direct statement, of conservation goals for agencies, e.g. the NPS. Under climate change and other stressors, agencies are now challenged to be far more specific about our goals for conservation. Ecological integrity is one concept promoted to guide new statements of conservation goals. Can you envision how agencies can use this concept to guide management decisions as native and non-native species begin to mix in new ways we can't yet understand?
If only agencies could do what their biologists want them to do. Agencies are controlled by politicians. And as we've seen with gas drilling all over the West, it was President Obama who says, drill, baby, drill now, everywhere. Get all the gas out of the ground. That's the policy now. So, and the poor people in the agencies have to do what the politicians say. So it's a political problem. And some people thought in voting for Obama, excuse me for being so political, they were doing the right thing, but now we see that he's changed his policy. So a test will be the Keystone Pipeline, because if he's really sincere about changing the trajectory that's pushing us towards global heating, warming, climate change, then that's a good place to draw a line in the tar sands.
My name is Margot, and I had the opportunity to hear David Foreman speak when I was in high school, and I was totally riveted. Went on to work for Louisa Wilcox at the Sierra Club on her Grizzly Bear project, but I'm now also a student of history, environmental history, and I too have had concerns about the displacement of people from wilderness areas and the idea that some historians have put forth that wilderness is a human construction that has come at a particular convenient time. And so more or less she asked the question I was going to ask, but I'd love to ask you a question in relation to my research site, Wrangell St. Elias National Park, where people have been allowed to remain living within the wilderness areas following the ANILCA legislation, which I imagine you're familiar with. And I wonder if you could speak to some of the controversy surrounding that idea and share your perspective with us, and perhaps on the Point Reyes oyster farms as well.
I don't know the details of the latter, but yeah, it's been a huge problem. As I said, the whole concept of manifest destiny and the conquest of the West in the United States, not to mention all the other continents, was to get rid of cultures that were an impediment or a perceived impediment to the advance of Western civilization, for example. And we've now seen that that was not a good policy. And I know historians of culture and environment keep bringing that subject up, but I think those days are largely gone, although in places like Brazil, the poor people, some of them indigenous, are being constantly moved and wiped out, exterminated by other human beings. I'm kind of a student of human nature, and I see these problems coming from our self-biased impulses, what used to be called sins, greed, for example, aversion, hatred. It's those impulses. I'm a biologist, as you can see, not a social scientist. But those impulses we have in us, called human nature, are at the root of these problems. And if we can deal with that, that would be great. That's going to take some genetic engineering.
Do we have one more from the web?
Yes, we have one from Ron Engel. The subject is sustainable agriculture. The question, Should we not be making common cause with people like Wes Jackson and Vandana Shiva, seeking to preserve, create forms of agriculture that are evolutionarily supportive of wild biodiversity, as well as sustainable livelihoods for people?
The answer is yes. Those two individuals you mentioned, I know, and they're doing wonderful work. They're, you know, Arne Næss used to say that we advance along a very broad front. And it takes many kinds of people doing many different things to change the world. It's not just scientists, it's not just social scientists, it's not just historians, it's not just corporate people in business. It takes all of us to do this. And it takes leadership. What we lack most, I think, is good moral leadership now.